will not hesitate to shut off their power as well.
We don't need them for anything. We don't need them for energy. We have more energy than they do. We don't need them for energy.
So today, Trump declared a national emergency because Ontario set a 25% tariff on all electricity coming into the U.S., which affects...
In March 2025, the lights stayed on, but something broke. Without warning, Ontario slapped a 25% surcharge on every megawatt of electricity sent to the United States. No announcement, no negotiation, just a midnight decision that hit New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, where it hurt their power grids. The numbers cold and brutal, roughly $7 added per megawatt hour, an extra $300,000 to $400,000 in daily costs for U.S. importers. More than 1.5 million American homes and businesses suddenly caught in the crossfire. By morning, control rooms in Albany lit up with red alerts. Grid operators watched prices spike in real time. Governors were on the phone. Utilities scrambled for answers. What looked like a routine policy shift turned out to be a calculated strike, a precise retaliation in a trade war that had until then spared the power lines. This wasn't just about electricity, it was about leverage. And in one move, Ontario proved it had it. This wasn't an accident, it was payback. When Ontario imposed its surprise electricity surcharge, it wasn't acting out of desperation, it was retaliating. Just weeks earlier, the United States had reimposed a 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum. And it didn't stop there. Officials in Washington openly floated the idea of doubling that rate to 50%, reigniting trade tensions that had simmered since the early days of USMCA. But this time, Canada didn't respond with counter-tariffs on ketchup or wine. It didn't fire off diplomatic statements, or wait for Ottawa to lead. Instead, Premier Doug Ford moved unilaterally, and he moved fast. He didn't need to wait for Ottawa because he'd found something more powerful than paperwork: a loophole. Under the terms of USMCA, electricity exports aren't covered by tariff protection. That means power flowing from Ontario to the U.S. grid could be taxed legally without violating the trade deal. And that's exactly what Ford did. By slapping a 25% surcharge on outbound power, he bypassed the rules without breaking them. No lawsuits, no WTO complaints, just a direct hit, legal, targeted, and immediate. This wasn't symbolic, it was surgical. Ford knew that while American tariffs on steel hurt factories over months, a surge in electricity costs could disrupt entire cities overnight. And that's exactly what happened. Grid operators scrambled, governors were blindsided, CEOs in manufacturing and energy sectors found themselves calculating new costs before dawn. And that was the point. Ontario didn't just retaliate, it revealed a structural weakness in the US-Canada energy relationship. Ford proved that when it came to cross-border energy, Canada still had plenty of leverage and wasn't afraid to use it. What began as a quiet surcharge on electricity exports quickly detonated across the American power grid. It didn't take days, it didn't even take hours. Within minutes, real-time alerts lit up inside grid control centers in New York and New England. Operators watched as prices spiked, margins tightened, and emergency protocols kicked in, not because of a blackout, but because of a policy from another country. In New York, where Ontario Power covers up to 6% of total electricity needs, the stress was immediate. The New York Independent System Operator NYSO flagged cost surges across its wholesale market, and by the end of the first day, contingency plans were already being drafted. Local utilities feared the surcharge would spike rates for industrial customers, data centers, and eventually households. At a press conference in Albany, Governor Kathy Hochul called the move unprecedented and demanded transparency from both the federal government and trade officials. Senator Chuck Schumer joined her, warning that a retaliatory energy policy should not be allowed to endanger grid reliability or working families. Meanwhile, in New England, the picture looked even worse. A regional report from ISO-NE estimated that even a 10% increase in Canadian electricity costs could add $66 million annually to grid operating expenses. And this wasn't 10%, it was 25%. The math was brutal. For every megawatt, imported American buyers were suddenly paying up to $7 more with no time to renegotiate supply contracts or reroute demand. The political shockwaves didn't stop there. In Michigan and Minnesota, where cities like Detroit and Duluth have long depended on Canadian hydropower to offset seasonal demand, utility executives scrambled. Some quietly labeled the surcharge the first direct casualty of the revived US-Canada trade war. Internal memos obtained by regional journalists revealed widespread concern. Municipal budgets blown open, industrial energy contracts thrown into chaos, and no immediate backup available. This wasn't a symbolic gesture, it was a fiscal wrecking ball. For small towns and manufacturing hubs, the problem wasn't just higher prices, it was uncertainty. Contracts signed months earlier were now under stress. Mayors were told to expect higher electricity bills without any say in the matter. School districts began recalculating operating costs. Wastewater facilities submitted emergency funding requests. At least one municipal office in upstate New York asked the state legislature for relief funds just to keep basic infrastructure running through the summer. And yet the average household, they never saw the policy memo, they just saw the bottom line change. Power bills ticked up. Utility providers sent vague notices citing supply disruptions. Social media filled with questions. What happened? Behind the scenes, officials were scrambling for answers too. Because until that moment, nobody had modeled this scenario. Nobody had imagined Ontario, the US's quiet, cooperative northern neighbor, would flip the script and weaponize energy. The most jarring realization wasn't the price hike, it was the dependency. The US had no contingency plan, no backup flow, no immediate replacement for clean, reliable Canadian power. For years, the assumption had been simple. Ontario's electricity would always be there, cheap, predictable, apolitical. Now that illusion had shattered, and everyone from governors to factory owners was learning the cost of assuming a neighbor would never say no. It starts with silence, not a blackout, but something close. A quiet substation in upstate New York, high-voltage lines humming at half capacity, engineers on night shift staring at monitors that used to stay green now flashing yellow. Power is still flowing, but not like before. Something's changed, and no one can stop looking at the numbers. Pull back. Inside a grid control room just outside Albany, screens light up with red alerts. Import prices spike, frequency margins tighten. Operators lean over dashboards, trading glances. "Where's the Ontario load?" someone mutters. No one answered. They already know. The surcharge has hit, and the system is feeling it not tomorrow, not next quarter now. Pull back again. We're in Toronto 3 days earlier. Premier Doug Ford steps to the podium. No press buildup, no diplomatic heads-up. Just a quiet but deliberate announcement, a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the United States. A policy crafted not out of chaos, but precision. Legal, immediate, strategic. The reporters in the room scribble it down. South of the border, it doesn't register yet, but it will. Pull further back. Now we're in Washington, D.C. weeks earlier. The U.S. Trade Office finalizes a revived 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum. There's talk, even threat of pushing it to 50%. It's part of a broader push by the Trump administration to bring manufacturing back home. The messaging is clear: protect American jobs. But the response is not yet visible. It's building, quietly. And finally, the last rewind. We're not in North America anymore. We're in Berlin, Seoul, Hanoi, Tokyo. For years, Canada has been forging its own energy path. Clean power, EV materials, rare earths, and above all, reliability. While the U.S. focused on tariffs and domestic messaging, Canada invested in leverage. Energy wasn't just infrastructure anymore. It was strategy. And electricity, that was the perfect tool because it lived in the gray zone. Not covered by USMCA, not regulated by WTO, not priced for conflict. Until now. In reverse, the whole sequence plays like a warning film played backwards: trade policy, retaliation, infrastructure pressure, regional crisis. Only this time, the damage isn't cinematic. It's real, it's happening, and it's not over. The lights didn't go out, but the illusion did. For years, the US-Canada electricity relationship was treated like a background process, always on, always stable, always there. In national energy charts, Canadian imports made up just 1% of the total US electricity mix. But regionally, in places like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, that number jumps to 12 to 14%. Not a margin, a lifeline. And now that lifeline is tangled in politics. Grid stability, once thought immune to international disputes, has entered the arena of trade warfare. The moment Ontario's surcharge landed, it shattered the long-held belief that energy was off-limits. Suddenly, electricity wasn't infrastructure. It was leverage. Clean power became a strategic asset, not just an environmental one. The message was clear: reliability is no longer guaranteed, it's negotiated. And the consequences didn't stay on the grid. As the energy squeeze hit, Ontario suppliers' assembly lines began to stall. Fuel pump modules, battery harnesses, specialized sensors, all delayed or suspended. In Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky, auto plants were forced to pause operations. The entire North American auto sector built on just-in-time logistics proved how fragile it really was when energy pricing cracked upstream. The cost wasn't just in dollars, it was in lost shifts, halted production, and broken trust. Because power became a weapon, not a utility. A trust deficit had opened, and it was growing fast. Utility CEOs, state regulators, and trade officials began asking the same question. If one of our most stable trade partners can hit us like this, who else might? Suddenly, American energy firms weren't just assessing capacity or pricing. They were auditing risk, geopolitical, political, and even personal. Boardrooms echoed with a new phrase: we want partners, not pressure points. And as the US questioned the relationship, Canada quietly moved on. Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta didn't just wait for apologies, they accelerated their pivot. New agreements were signed with Germany, South Korea, and Vietnam, focused on EV batteries, rare earth materials, and green hydrogen supply chains. These weren't symbolic gestures, they were structural shifts, deals built to last, routes that no longer flowed through Detroit or Chicago, but through Rotterdam, Seoul, and Ho Chi Minh City. It was a message the US hadn't expected to hear. You're no longer the only customer in the room. What began as a retaliatory surcharge had opened a deeper question, one that couldn't be solved with a phone call or a policy memo. What happens when your closest neighbor stops seeing you as essential? The warning signs aren't flashing. They're steady, quiet, real, and they're already changing the future. This wasn't a fluke. It was a stress test. And the US failed it not because the lights went out, but because the trust did. If America wants to avoid being blindsided again, it needs to act now decisively, not defensively. That begins with trade rules. The USMCA, hailed as a modern upgrade to NAFTA, has a glaring gap: it doesn't cover electricity. That loophole allowed Ontario to legally strike where the US was most exposed. Plugging it won't be easy, but it's necessary, because no trade deal should leave critical infrastructure unprotected. Next comes resilience. The US can no longer afford to treat imported power as a given. Investments in domestic grid flexibility, cross-state transmission upgrades, and backup generation capacity must move from policy papers to construction sites. When 14% of a region's power comes from across the border, any disruption, political or otherwise, becomes a direct threat to household bills and factory uptime. But it's not just about hard infrastructure. It's about rebuilding soft trust. That means diplomatic outreach, not just damage control. Real engagement with Canada based on transparency, reliability, and binding coordination is key. Because when friends start acting like competitors, silence becomes expensive. And lastly, the US must treat energy policy like what it truly is: industrial strategy. Every power disruption echoes across sectors. From auto plants to server farms, one price shock can trigger production delays, layoffs, and economic ripple effects far beyond the energy grid. Planning for these contingencies is no longer optional, it's national security. Was this just a warning shot or the start of something bigger? Canada used electricity not as a service, but as leverage, and the US got caught off guard. Is America ready to treat energy like strategy, or will it keep assuming that trust can't be switched off? Drop your thoughts below. If this deep dive changed your view on energy and trade, hit like, subscribe, and share. It matters more than you think.